Welcome to the American Shoulder and Elbow Surgeons Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Chalmers, a shoulder and elbow surgeon at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Rachel Frank, a sports and shoulder surgeon at the University of Colorado in Denver. Rachel, how are you?
Doing well, Pete. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Before we get started, I should mention that the views expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views of the American Shoulder and Elbow Surgeons Society, the University of Utah, the University of Colorado, or the institutions of any of our guests. Today, we have a very special episode of the podcast focusing specifically on the COVID pandemic and professional sports. It's certainly been a whirlwind of the last few months as we've seen disruptions to seasons, as we've seen seasons go into bubbles. The NHL season's come to an end. The NBA season is winding down. MLB's in the playoffs, and the NFL and the MLS are certainly in the thick of things. We're joined today by several renowned professional head team physicians who've been right in the middle of everything with respect to their teams. First, we have Dr. Eric McCarty from the University of Colorado in Boulder, the head team physician for the Colorado Avalanche. Dr. McCarty, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you, Pete and Rachel. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk with you guys.
Next, we have Dr. Tom Noonan from the Stedman Hawkins Clinic in Denver, Colorado, and the head team physician for the Colorado Rockies. Dr. Noonan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Pete, and thanks, Rachel. Really appreciate having me on for this.
Well, thank you, guys. Let's get right into it. We'd like to ask each of you, and we'll have you go kind of one at a time. What are the COVID-19 testing procedures and policies on each of your respective professional teams, knowing that you guys also take care of high school and collegiate athletes? But for your pro teams, the Avalanche and the Rockies, how often are the athletes and staff getting tested? How are they getting tested? Is it with saliva? Is it with PCR testing? And how quickly are you getting the results? EMAC, let's start with you. What was the protocol for the Avalanche?
Well, it's really interesting because we went through a couple phases of returning to the sport. And this began all the way back in June. And first it was just returning to the practice rink and getting guys in it. The NHL did a great job with consultation with infectious disease physicians, basically in Canada and United States. And really, it was a very well-regulated thing that they did. They had the athletes get tested daily, and the athletes, everybody was checked. It was a very secure place. They could only have about 6 guys at a time, and they couldn't all be together in a weight room, but they could be on the ice. And so that's when it started. And then they did a tremendous job in the bubble up in Canada, in Toronto and Edmonton. So what that entailed was testing daily. And basically this bubble, they could not go out of this secure area, basically from the hotel to the rink. They did have some excursions where they were taken on a bus to someplace and they could just get out of this bubble. But the NHL did not have any positive tests during the time in the bubble, which is really impressive. So daily tests. They had time when they could get out and do some things within the bubble, but it was very secure. And one last thing I want to mention too, it was if I, as a team physician, went up to the bubble, I would have to be in quarantine in my hotel room for 4 days and get tested every day. And once I was negative, then I could come out of my hotel room and then be a part of the of what was going on. But even then, I wouldn't be in the locker room. I would just be in the stands and just see each individual player if somebody needed to be seen. So really a great example of how the bubble can work.
Totally. And it's really impressive that there were no positives in that bubble, as we're starting to see with really all other sports, some positives here and there, and we can see the ripple effect that those have. Tom, what about you? What's the protocol been for the Rockies? How often are the athletes getting tested, the training staff, coaching staff, medical staff, et cetera? And what type of test is it? And how quickly do you get your results? Is it same day? Is it next day? What are the protocols here?
Yeah, and so I would echo what Eric said, and that MLB really did an incredible job also, dealing with a lot of different docs and societies and so forth. And I mean, we have like a 130-page medical manual. And I think the MLB job is even harder because even though the playoff teams now are in a bubble, our entire regular season was, no bubble. And we had teams traveling all over the United States and thankfully, very few issues. So baseball effectively divided personnel and players and everything into different tiers. Tier 1, which would include all the players, athletic trainers, physicians, and so forth, all got tested every other day, and that was a saliva antigen test. There was, and what they also wanted to do was not disrupt any ability of the general public to not have access to tests. And so they contracted with a lab actually out in Utah that does the testing for baseball's drug tests, and they were doing all these saliva tests. So these tests were getting done and then FedExed to Utah, and I think this company also had a site in New York. So they were being FedExed overnight, and once they received it, I believe they had like a 6-hour turnaround. So if you got tested one day, you generally find out the day after. And if there was a positive test, they would follow that up with a PCR with the deep nasopharyngeal swab. So that was the protocol that we followed.
And tell us a little bit, if the PCR comes back positive, what was your return to play protocol for athletes who tested positive?
I guess, Eric, you didn't have any, so you don't probably even have an answer, right?
Hey, Tom, no, yeah, it's kind of hard to answer when we didn't have any. So I'll let you tackle that one, Tom.
Yeah. So the first thing they did was immediately, contact tracing. And so anybody that had any meaningful contact with that player was quarantined. At that point, and the people quarantined at that point, it converted to everyday testing. And then in terms of return to play, obviously the player had to be asymptomatic, and then they had to have 2 negative tests. We did also run through the scenario. I don't think it ever happened, but as you all are aware, there are some people that become entirely asymptomatic but continue to test positive for weeks, sometimes even months. And so we did have the hypothetical situation that if that were to occur, that player could be returned back to play with a positive test as long as they were entirely asymptomatic. I think it was for like 2 weeks, and you were able to circumvent that because that is a possibility.
Now, when we talk about not just athletes but staff members, but really anyone in the organization, if anyone does test positive, and again, this is probably going to apply more to Tom than to EMAC, but what's the process for shutting things down for isolation? Once you read the headlines, especially right now in the NFL, and a player tests positive and the whole facility is shut down. We've had some experience with that in the MLS. What's been the protocol in the MLB for that right now, Tom?
Thankfully, we never had a positive test on the Rockies in the season. So I think the 2 examples in Major League Baseball, one was the Marlins, one was the Cardinals. If there was a positive test, they would cancel the game, usually for the next 2 days. Obviously be testing everything else. If it was isolated, they could quarantine the people that had direct contact and then resume play fairly quickly. Now, in both the Marlins and the Cardinals, they had multiple people test positive, and so each of those teams were shut down, I believe, for about a week. But I think those were the only 2 times there was a long time shutdown. I know San Francisco had a positive that ended up being a false positive, and so they only missed, I think, a game. But I think it was kind of similar to NFL and MLS. If it's like a single positive, not a huge deal. But if you had multiple people, then they start canceling games and shutting down facilities.
And tell us a little bit, have you had a restriction on the number of healthcare providers at practices or at games? Have there restrictions on, are you practicing some social distancing has affected your ability to care for these athletes?
So baseball, it was hard because there was a limited number of these tier one spots, and so we were, normally we cover the team with about 6 of us, rotating coverage, and we have different specialties and so forth. But because of the limitations, we were only allowed to have 2 physicians that could cover all the games. We pretty much wore N95 masks when present in the training room. There wasn't really any specific rule about don't get close to a player, but there's certainly encouragement to not congregate and to keep your 6 feet away from folks. But it was a little challenging because we had to deal with a much pared down medical staff.
And Eric, tell us a little bit about how this has affected you, especially also with CU football. I mean, are you guys changing the way you're covering CU football with fellows, being present, not being able to present? Tell us how that's affecting both your educational mission and then also your ability to cover for, these Pac-12 athletes that, at least in Utah, are basically professional athletes.
Yeah, it's very interesting. The hockey was just completely away from our institution, and so completely different than what we will see when the University of Colorado starts football up at the beginning of November. And so, the hockey, they are now in their off season, and they still have rules, regarding if they're doing any training, but it is their off season. So it'll be interesting to see when they come back to the season, which is supposed to begin at the beginning of January, what it's going to look like. I think we don't even know if they're going to try to do mini bubbles, have, various isolated cities across the United States and Canada where they may go and play a series of games in a mini bubble. I can't imagine they're going to be doing a lot of traveling back and forth between all the cities like they normally do. So that's NHL. And looking at University of Colorado, we just found out, within the past 2 weeks that we were going to have a season. And so that has been very interesting because as of, the beginning of September, we were not. And so now we're getting ready for the season, and the guys are getting tested. They all got tested yesterday. We are actually going into a kind of a mini bubble at the University of Colorado, meaning what is going on is that in agreement with the Boulder County Health Department, that the team will be staying in the same hotel, and they can only go between the hotel and the practice field. If there's anything else with class and things like that, of course they can go, but they have to be very strict with the mask. They of course can't go out to any social gatherings, and so the testing is very complete. We have a new test that is a fairly rapid test that the guys are doing, and that's what the Pac-12 has adopted. So in regards to that, that's going to be very interesting to see how that goes and how we handle things once we go on the road. I think we'll probably be tested before we get on the bus to go to the plane. We get on the plane, you get to the city, you go to the hotel, you do not go out of the hotel. You then go to the game, and everybody stays basically within everything once they're tested. From what I understand, the athletes will be tested the day of the game as well. So what that means for our fellows and educationally is unknown right now. We don't know how this is going to play out. The games themselves, we haven't had that, we still have a month, but we have not decided yet what that is going to mean on the sidelines of the games, and we don't know what that means with even fans in the stadium. And so, I'm pushing hard for the fellows to have a part of it. I don't think we'll have as many as we normally do, which is several on the sidelines, but they are of help, and they can be helpful for not only us, but also the other team who travels maybe 1 or 2 docs, and they can help take a player to x-rays. They can help facilitate things. So just in that regards alone, I think we will have the opportunity to have some fellows at the football games in an open environment. Might be a lot different in a closed environment such as hockey or basketball once that comes around. So very interesting, Pete. We'll see what happens, and hopefully we have this figured out, and hopefully we are playing the University of Utah on December 11th, like we're supposed to. If everything goes well, we will.
Hey, Eric, what kind of test is Pac-12 using?
It's called I think the name of the company is Quidel, and I am not familiar with the various aspects of it. Some type of PCR, but it's a quick test. Rapid meaning within 2 hours. I think they could actually do it a little faster. What I understand, even 15 minutes. But I am not familiar with all the nuances of it. But it was a game changer once they got that. That basically allowed the Pac-12 to feel more comfortable with testing of the athletes daily and being able to allow them to play. So you know how they test, before they even start practice, and it gives you test results. So you're not trying to track back a couple days from when the testing occurred. And so that has been very important, and we'll be very interested to see how that works out. I am not familiar with the accuracy of the test. I understand that is well vetted. I think it's from Silicon Valley, and we hope that it is as good as they say it is.
I think MLB, each team also did have their own machine, which was a rapid test. It actually may have been that test, and it was like a nasal swab only. And for MLB, it was designed for, like, let's say you show up at the stadium and some guy has symptoms, you could test right on the spot. Now they would follow it with the PCR, but I think MLB used that one for again, if you needed to know something right away.
It's incredible how different approaches and philosophies and protocols are between, colleges, pro teams, even within different teams within the same league, within the MLB or MLS or NFL, within the bubble, like with the NHL and NBA, obviously everyone's getting tested with the same exact test. And so that's much more consistent, but there is some variability between teams within the same league, which I think, may create some difficulties moving forward, but also maybe okay, just so many unknowns. Another question and thought I think that comes up, especially for a lot of the docs that are going to be listening to this podcast, and also a lot of fans of sport in general, is the pre, during, and post-game contact that players have with each other, including at team meals, team meetings, even celebrations on the field. You score a touchdown, you all celebrate together, or in sports like basketball, you're right on top of each other. Football, you're right on top of each other during the whole game, essentially. If in theory, all the athletes and staff and personnel in the stadium get tested and are negative, this should be okay. But of course, we've seen that in several instances, this is not okay, or a player or a staff member is positive, but just not reactive on the test yet. So as your team's head team's physicians, how do you guys advise athletes or advise your teams in terms of contact before, during, and after games? Any thoughts on team meals? Should those be avoided, or should those be more socially distanced? Team meetings and then post-game celebrations. How do you kind of talk about that with your teams? Tom, let's start with you. Any thoughts on that with regard to the Rockies?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So MLB really carefully spelled out all that stuff. For example, in terms of when the players can show up. So normally, for like a 6:40 game, a lot of players would come in, 11 or 12 o'clock. I think it was like 2 or 3 o'clock before they were even allowed in the clubhouse. And then there was no such thing as like a team meal anymore. All the players, and us for that matter, had an app on our phone. And then you would go on the app, order what you want, and then the kitchen would make like a to-go meal, and then they would take it to a section of the stadium where they could sit spaced apart and eat it. And then they really tried to eliminate any contact. Now, thankfully for baseball, it's a pretty good COVID-friendly sport just because there's so much space and it's generally outside. But they discouraged any sort of contact. So no high fives, no touching each other. They even had I think if 3 people touch a baseball, they got rid of the baseball and got a new one. So we were going through like multiples of what we normally go through in baseballs. But it was very interesting that MLB, again, there's this 130-page manual that spelled out. In fact, they even wanted the players to not take a shower. Like they encouraged them to like leave the stadium in their uniform, go back to a hotel and shower, which I think most people ignored that, but they really made an effort to keep them apart from each other.
EMAC, in the bubble, I'm sure the athletes all had, the NHL athletes all had their protocols and were instructed on what to do, what not to do. But still, you score a goal, you're going to come up to each other, and obviously they have their helmets on with masks and, or with their masks, their facial protective gear, but they're still in pretty close contact. Any concerns about that, especially as you look forward to kind of next season? And then same question applies to CU football. What are you guys going to do about team meals, team meetings, et cetera?
So the NHL, they had rules like even in the bubble, they still had to wear a mask when they were not doing anything, when they weren't competing. And so, the only time they really didn't wear a mask is if they were doing any kind of weight training, where they were really exerting themselves. A simple weightlifting, they would. Even in the training room, they had to wear it. Even in the locker room, they had to wear it until they got on the ice, and then they did not have to wear it on the ice. And so, but everybody else did except for the coaches, which is interesting. You look at the NFL and they're getting fined for it, but if you notice, the NHL coaches, they did not have to in that area, but all the trainers and physicians and equipment staff had to. So a lot of rules, and obviously a very close physical contact sport, a little bit different than baseball for sure. I think they were able to get away with the contact and the closeness of all because of the way that they conducted the bubble, for sure. I think if it was a little bit different, it would be more like football, and that's where you see, some of the increases in numbers. And not only in pro, but look at college. How many games have been canceled or postponed because of somebody, 1, 2, 3, even a dozen players getting COVID. And so a little bit different than baseball for sure, and a little bit different in college than pro. It's a bit tougher climate to be able to control, and it's going to be very interesting to see in the limited time that the Pac-12 has a season, which is about half the normal games that they normally would, how successful that's going to be. I think they've learned some things from the watching other teams and leagues go through the September and seeing what they do, and hopefully we can avoid that. But yeah, to answer your question, of course there's some current concern with the closeness and high fives and all that. But I would have to say, at least at the collegiate level, and you've probably seen this, most teams, the guys have a gate around the neck, and when they go on the sideline, they're supposed to put it up. And I know we are at the University of Colorado that the only time that gator comes off the face is when they're actually playing on the field and conducting themselves. They come on the sidelines, gator goes up. So it'll be very interesting to see how things progress.
With this being such an unusual time, tell us some of the athlete concerns you've heard. What are some of the biggest concerns on the player side of the equation in these unusual times?
So I think a couple things. One, obviously athletes were, most concerned about their families, and even some of the guys in baseball that opted out, it wasn't necessarily they were concerned from their own health, but they had family members that had health issues or parents or whatnot. So that was definitely a concern. The other thing I got to say, it was very hard, I think, psychologically on the players too, because it was this, this environment where their normal social interaction was entirely different. And obviously these are young guys. I mean, they couldn't do anything fun at night on the road. Literally, they were expected to sit in their hotel room the entire time. Had to go pick up at the go meal, eat it in their room. So I think a lot of guys, even though it was a very short Major League Baseball season, were really kind of emotionally exhausted getting through it, because it was such a huge change in their normal, social rituals, if you will.
I would echo that with the NHL. You think about that even more so. They were away from their families. They went up to the bubbles in Canada towards the end of July, third or fourth week of July, and for the teams that continued to win, if they went to the Stanley Cup, they were there over 2 months, and this was without family. This was in this bubble. This was what an unusual thing for them. I think you think about it. Some guys, you want to win the Stanley Cup, and hockey guys always want to win it. But then there's probably some relief if you're not playing that well and your team's just getting beat in a series, that you're just happy to get out of there and get home and get out of the bubble. And so it psychologically, it's a huge issue. And also, normally the NHL playoffs and the Stanley Cup, you have the home ice advantage. And that's a big advantage in hockey for sure. Well, there was none of that this year. And then on top of that, having the psychological aspect of being in this bubble, and it's kind of like Groundhog Day every day, just going your same room, going to the arena and doing the same thing for 2 months. It certainly took a lot of mental fortitude to get to that point and then to finally win it.
Yeah, I gotta say it was, Eric, you probably obviously didn't go up to Canada to see a game, but it was a weird atmosphere. I must say on TV, I think it comes off pretty good because they add in the crowd noise, and to me, it seems like pretty realistic watching these games on television. But I would go up into the stadium and watch some of our games, and there would be no fans. I mean, there was a few like officials and whatnot, but there'd be like 10 people in the entire stadium with these guys out playing a game. I think for them, it had to be incredibly weird when they're used to playing in front of 30, 40, 50,000 people.
In hockey, that's such a big deal too, because you feed off the energy of the crowd, and piped in music doesn't do it. And the same will be true for college football too. You play at these stadiums, and when we play at USC this year, that Coliseum is going to look empty, and it may give us a bit of more of an advantage. At least gives a chance to beat the Trojans. It's going to be a tough go of it as it is, but that's what a different deal for all the players that play the game.
Have any of the athletes, sorry to interrupt you, but just a good question. These concerns are so unusual on the players' side because of these unprecedented times, and this is the first season of their career when they've ever truly had to deal with this. Have any of them expressed any concern about actually contracting the virus and the health ramifications of having COVID-19? Or has that part been less important for the athletes because most of them are going to be in that, if not all of them, in that healthy category where if they unfortunately contract the virus, hopefully they'll be very minimally symptomatic. But, have they expressed concern about what happens if I get the virus, or has that not really come up? Emac, what about you for the Avalanche and for CU football?
I didn't have any specific concerns that I heard, and I've had a lot of interactions with the athletes. And it's interesting, as part of our lead in to go back to hockey, starting in May and June, we had numerous Zoom meetings, with the players and teams to go over protocol and to go over things. And I think everybody got it, and, they want to play hockey. So they were willing to abide by the rules, and I think if they abided by these rules, I think they felt very safe. And so, CU football, if you're 18 to 22, everybody feels like they're invincible anyway. So I'm not sure that they really quite get it as like a professional athlete does. And baseball has some older guys, so it'll be interesting to see what Dr. Noonan says. But in terms of the college athletes, I mean, that's why I think you see so many reports across the country of these parties at fraternities and things happening, because college kids think they're invincible and that they have no ramifications, even if they do get the virus. And so I have not heard of any concerns across our team, but I would say this, it's a concern of ours if any of our athletes get it, just because of the potential cardiac issues that can occur. And one of our protocols is if a kid gets it, and this is true in the NHL too, if you get COVID or you're COVID positive, basically you're getting a cardiac screening before you can return to play. And that's an absolute necessity.
Yeah,
I know
I think. Sorry. Go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, in terms of the guys I talked to, I don't think they were all that worried about themselves, getting sick. I think, again, families was a concern for them. And then I think they also realized that, if this goes south and a bunch of people get sick, the season could get, in fact, the first week when we had the Marlins and Cardinals, they were talking about, should we shut it down? And that's, obviously there are guys on huge contracts, but there's a lot of guys that depend on this income. And if the season gets canceled, they don't get paid. So I think a lot of guys, again, weren't so worried about themselves personally getting sick, but they wanted to keep the season going.
Now, I know we talk a lot about professional athletes, but certainly the largest group of athletes is high school athletes. Certainly the problems with these teams are that access to testing isn't as robust. They don't have the same resources. Tell us what your experiences have been caring for high school athletes since the advent of COVID.
I'll be happy to tackle that one. It's very interesting in the Boulder area. There's a school district, and about 2/3 of the schools in Colorado, basically, they gave the choice to the schools whether to have football in the fall or in the spring. And 2/3 of the schools in Boulder Valley are playing this fall, and they just are having their first game this weekend. And then 1/3 of them are playing in the spring. And some of it had to do with the other teams in their league. And of course, if you wanted to play in one season, but most of the teams in the league want to play in the other, you kind of had to follow your league. But what's happened in Colorado is very interesting. We've already seen some games be canceled. One of the very good football programs in the state, Mullen High School, they recently had to cancel last week because of a player, maybe a couple players testing positive for that. And so in high school, I think, you may see the COVID, and we may not even know that it's happening because many of these kids will be asymptomatic and they're not getting tested. And so you're really probably only getting tested if you have any symptoms at all. And so there may be more of it going on than we know. I think the biggest concern I have with these high school athletes is that the lack of conditioning and the lack of preseason practices, that you're going to probably see injuries. And this is I would say we'll see the COVID-related uptick in injuries that is not related to having the virus, but is related to this season of having COVID in the environment and lack of conditioning. So it'll be very interesting.
Yeah, that's a great point, Eric. Because I don't know what the NHL experience was, and I've not seen statistics about MLB, but I think a lot of our impressions is that we had more injuries this year, which doesn't surprise me because baseball is just such an orchestrated preseason and such a rhythmic preseason where they go through the same routine every year. And then this year, we had 3 weeks of spring training and they got shut down, and then they're at home and they didn't even know if they'd had a season because there was negotiations between the players and the owners and of course health concerns. And then all of a sudden, a deal gets struck and it's like, you got 3 weeks of spring training. They don't play any other team. So they're just doing scrimmages. And then all of a sudden they're playing games that count against other teams. And just that abrupt increase in intensity, I think we saw a lot more injuries this year in baseball, and it seems like we've kind of seen the same in the NFL. So I think that's a very valid point, for our high school athletes as well. I think it'll be interesting to see, with respect to COVID, how it goes once football's up and running. Although I think all these teams have, at least where I am, kind of South Denver, they have been kind of continuing to work out, and it doesn't seem like the numbers have gotten too bad. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
As we look toward the fall and the winter, and we see what fall football brings us, and we learn from our past experiences over the last 6 months, what do you guys see as some of the biggest challenges coming in the next season, the next fall season, winter season, et cetera? And along that line, what do you see as the ripple effect with these shorter seasons and condensed seasons? Obviously, overuse injuries, acute injuries, all of the injuries are potentially going to be changing with regard to epidemiology due to this unusual circumstance. We have, as we were talking about a little bit earlier, we have altered draft considerations for all of the pro leagues, and that has a downstream ripple effect as well. What do you guys think about that, and how will that change the dynamic of sports and sports medicine? Emek, let's start with you on that.
Well, I think the word is uncertainty, and that's been the buzzword for 6 months. There's a lot of uncertainty as to what's next, and it's hard to plan because we don't know what is going on next week or the week after or the month after, right? So the uncertainty of it all makes it hard to plan. It makes it hard to get a regular rhythm of training, of conditioning, of the normal things that you would do. I mean, for instance, for the NHL, we just had our draft this week, right? Normally, after the draft, we bring the kids in and we have a little bit of a training camp, and we bring some of the other players that have been, drafted before, and they have a kind of a young players, several days of training, and they even scrimmage a little bit. Well, we're not doing that this year, and so not like it is normally. And so the things have certainly been off in timing, and that makes it hard for all the people that plan, the administration, the coaches, and the players. And the same thing will happen with these seasons. If you're starting a little bit later, for hockey, which is going to be later, normally their training camp would start in early September. Well, their training camp may not even start till January this year. And so what does that do to the whole rhythm and cycle of everything? And then again, what's it going to look like after that? And then getting the groups of people to train together is the other thing. It's limited. So you can't get, 20 or 30 guys at a time to train, to lift, to all that. Now, of course, practicing you can, but you can't do the training and conditioning that you normally would. And so I definitely think that this cycle, it's still going to take it's not going to be normal next fall. And it's going to take at least another year through this. So maybe by 2022, we will see a more normal fall, but I don't even think next year will be.
Yeah, I think baseball, barring something bad happening in these next couple of weeks, they obviously will make it through a season. The interesting thing is, 4 months from now is spring training, and we have 7 minor league teams and a major league team at our facility. So you're talking over 200 athletes. Right now, it just doesn't even seem possible. And as you all may be aware, also, the entire minor league baseball season was canceled, which is pretty significant because baseball is a very different sport. NFL and NBA guys get drafted and immediately go play professionally at the highest level. But in baseball, typically you get drafted and then spend 3 or 4 years in the minor leagues before you would make it to the major leagues. And those developmental years are very important. So there's a whole group of guys that basically got no development this season. Potentially that could occur again next year, which ends up affecting them, later in their careers when they typically do end up making reasonable money. And then, as we talked earlier, the whole spill down effect into college. and into high school. But I agree with Eric. I don't know when we're going to see normal, and there's certainly a lot of uncertainty.
Well, Doctors McCarty and Noonan, we want to thank you so much for joining us today. Your experience and expertise with taking care of all athletes, and in particular professional athletes, is incredible. And certainly, I think uncertainty and unknowns are the two buzzwords we can all take away. But your expertise with taking care of these athletes and knowing about these issues and helping guide our listeners, for all of our listeners who take care of professional, collegiate, high school athletes, as well as, weekend warrior athletes, I think this information will be really helpful. And again, we want to thank you for taking the time with us tonight to chat. And with that, that's really all the time we have for this podcast. But again, we want to thank you all very much. And for all our shoulder and elbow listeners out there, please don't forget to subscribe. And for Pete Chalmers, I'm Rachel Frank. We'll see you next time.
Hey, well, thanks, Rachel and Pete. I love listening to you guys. You do a great job with this podcast. And so keep up the good work. Really enjoy it, and love what you're doing.
Yeah, again, Rachel, Pete, thanks very much. Really appreciate what you're doing, and like Eric, I enjoy it as well.
All right, guys, thank you so much.